The Tower of London may be today mostly associated with the executions and brutal torture events that took place there, but it is today a site of royal burial where a number of tragic queens of England are buried within the walls. The fortress began as a powerful symbol of the monarchy and then a royal residence, but during the Tudor period, it became somewhere where executions took place and where torture using devices such as the rack were administered, including even once upon a woman. But there are still today, buried within the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, within the tower, 3 queens who ruled over England, 2 alongside their husband as his consort, but 1 queen who for 9 days reigned in her own right. They lie inside of a burial vault and under the floor of the chapel, but there is also a crypt within the tower in which many infamous and notorious people are buried, including those who lost their heads on the nearby execution scaffold of Tower Hill. Today, we look inside the Royal Burial Vault of the Tower of London, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. The Chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula today sits very close to the oldest part of the Tower of London, known as the White Tower. It was founded around the year 1110 by Henry I, and to begin with, this chapel was outside of the original walls of the Tower of London, and it was built so that the king could worship in public and that the people of London could see their monarch undertaking his religious duties. The small chapel continued to be used for many years, and as the Tower of London expanded and underwent huge renovations, the curtain walls enveloped and swallowed the chapel up so that it would be forever within the fortress as it still is today. But the church today contains many different monuments and dedications, including those who governed the tower and looked after the day-to-day running of it, but the church is the burial place to some of the most famous prisoners who were held under lock and key, including 2 of Henry VIII's queens and wives and the 9-day queen. Anne Boleyn was the second wife of Henry VIII, and her downfall was plotted by Thomas Cromwell, as the king wanted to rid of Anne and he wanted to marry Jane Seymour. Anne was accused of incest, treason and adultery, and she would be executed inside the Tower of London on the 19th of May, 1536. Anne Boleyn had her head struck clean off of her shoulders by an expert executioner and swordsman who had been brought over from France. Anne, following her execution, was then placed into an oak chest used for bow staves, and her body was then taken into the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. There was no huge funeral, but she was quietly thrown into a grave near to the altar, and her ladies watched as the earth was thrown over her remains. Anne's burial inside of the chapel was the first of a royal who had been executed inside the tower's walls, and she was the first royal to be interred there. Kings and queens had died inside the tower walls before, but for example, King Henry VI was murdered there, and also Elizabeth of York died inside the tower giving birth, but these 2 were both buried elsewhere. The chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula was not intended to be a site of royal burial at all. The next royal who lost her head inside the tower was Henry VIII's 5th wife, Katherine Howard, and she had been condemned to death for cheating on the king and for treason. Katherine Howard was not executed by sword, but instead was executed by the commoner's axe, which was said to have been less reliable and more problematic. This took place on the 13th of February, 1542, and the skilled axeman took her head off in one clean blow. After her execution, her remains were collected up in a sheet, and they were then taken into the chapel and thrown into a roughly dug grave, but Henry VIII had given instructions for her remains to be covered in quicklime to dissolve and decompose them quicker. And this led to Katherine Howard's remains never being found inside the chapel. Now, the final royal, or queen, buried inside there is Lady Jane Grey, the 9-day queen who ruled after Edward VI. Jane was deposed by Queen Mary I, the oldest daughter of Henry VIII, and she remained inside the Tower of London as a prisoner where she had been before for awaiting her coronation. It looked as if Jane would be spared, but the reality of the situation was too grave for Mary I, as Jane posed a serious threat to her reign. Lady Jane Grey was either 16 or 17 when she was executed by axe inside the Tower of London, and like Anne Boleyn, she was buried with some degree of dignity. There were many other victims of the Tower of London who were buried within the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, including Margaret Pole, the Countess of Salisbury, who had royal blood through her uncle being King Edward IV, and there was also Jane Boleyn, who was executed alongside Katherine Howard, Robert Devereux, the once favourite of Queen Elizabeth I, and some of the Tudor period's most notorious people. Many people who lost their heads upon Tower Hill were also buried in the chapel, including Thomas Cromwell, Sir Thomas More, James Scott, the Duke of Monmouth, and the illegitimate son of Charles II and Bishop John Fisher. But over the centuries following the Tudor period, the chapel fell into a state of disrepair, and it was certainly somewhere which was not fit as a royal burial site. Because of this, during the reign of Queen Victoria, there was a huge amount of renovation work performed, and this led to the exhumation of many people who were buried inside the small church. This included Anne Boleyn, whose remains were found. On the 9th of November 1876, the workers dug up and exhumed Anne Boleyn, the executed second wife of Henry VIII. Her remains had been found where they were recorded, and they were found in front of the high altar, and 5 men had gathered to exhume her. They began to lift the pavement, and at a depth of 2 feet the body of Anne Boleyn was found. Her bones had been heaped together in one spot, but the grave had been disturbed by a collapsing, decaying coffin of a 54-year-old woman named Hannah Beresford, who had been buried close to Anne in 1750. Because of the discovery of the body of the Queen, the royal doctor, Dr. Frederick Mowat, was summoned to the Tower, and his team then carefully recorded and forensically examined the remains of the Queen. Of course, they were looking for signs of a woman who had lost her head by decapitation in a brutal manner, and this is what they found, and Dr. Mowat stated of the remains that they belonged to a female between 25 and 30 years of age, of a delicate frame of body, and who had been of slender and perfect proportions. The forehead and lower jaw were small and especially well formed. The vertebrae were particularly small, especially one joint, the atlas, which was that next to the skull, and that they bore witness to the Queen's little neck. A later, more thorough examination concluded. The bones of the head indicate a well-formed round skull with an intellectual forehead, straight orbital ridge, large eyes, oval face, and rather square full chin. The remains of the vertebra and the bones of the lower limbs indicate a well-formed woman of middle height, with a short and slender neck. The ribs show depth and roundness of chest. The hand and feet bones indicate delicate and well-shaped hands and feet with tapering fingers and a narrow foot. Anne Boleyn's body was then placed inside of a new coffin, a small lead container, and a plaque was placed upon her coffin ready for reburial. As mentioned, the body of Katherine Howard was not found, possibly due to the quicklime which had been added on her remains upon the King's orders, this substance decomposing her remains much quicker. But they may also not have been found due to the age that she was when she was executed, and that her bones had not hardened, meaning that she would have disappeared into the ground quicker than adult bones. Lady Jane's remains were also discovered and found. The chapel's building work was completed and finished, and with this, remains were then placed back into the ground. The most prominent burials were placed under the altar, with James Scott, the illegitimate son of Charles I, being buried directly beneath it. This area below the altar became an unofficial royal burial vault, as the remains of Anne Boleyn and Lady Jane were interred directly there. There is a memorial plaque marking these sites today, as is there one for Katherine Howard, but this is just a memorial to her, and there is no remains of Henry VIII's 5th wife buried under the stones, as her remains were never found. There is also a crypt inside the Tower of London's chapel, and this has become a place where many lesser people were interred, such as Thomas Cromwell, and this is today not accessible to the public. The remains, the corpses of Sir Thomas More, is also interred here. It's in its own tomb without a head. The chapel has been described as no sadder spot on earth than that little cemetery. Death is there associated, not as in Westminster Abbey and St Paul's, with genius and virtue, with public veneration and with imperishable renown, not as in our humblest churches and churchyards, with everything that is most endearing in social and domestic charities, but with whatever is darkest in human nature and in human destiny, with the savage triumph of implacable enemies, with the inconstancy, the ingratitude, the cowardice of friends, and with all the miseries of fallen greatness and blighted fame. Thither have been carried through successive ages by the rude hands of jailers, without one mourner following, the bleeding relics of men who had been the captains of armies, the leaders of parties, the oracles of senates, and the ornaments of courts. Today, the chapel of St Peter ad Vincula can be visited, and it is a poignant place where queens are buried. Recently, when we visited, we saw a beefeater having a quiet moment of reflection upon the gravestone and sit where Anne Boleyn was buried. A solitary red rose was laid on her grave marker out of respect for a queen who lost her head 500 years ago. It is a much quieter sight than Westminster Abbey and St George's Chapel, but today it is still a site of royal burial. Thank you for watching, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. And again, thank you so much for watching.